Peter Coleman has more than 30 years' experience in the global oil and gas industry, covering Asia, the Americas, Africa, and Australasia. Peter has been Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Woodside since he joined the company in 2011. Born in rural Victoria, Peter graduated with a Bachelor of Engineering from Monash University in 1983, and he has an MBA from Deakin University. He completed advanced management training at the University of Virginia, Thunderbird Management School, and at Columbia University. Peter began his career with ExxonMobil following graduation from Monash, and he stayed with the company until joining Woodside. Peter's on the board of the Business Council of Australia. He's chairman of the Australia-Korea Foundation, and he's a member of the advisory group for Australia-Africa relations. He is also a member of the executive committee of the Australia-Japan Business Cooperation Council and the Monash Industry Council of Advisors. Peter has been awarded the honorary title of Adjunct Professor in Corporate Strategy from the University of Western Australia, is an Alumni Lifetime and Achievement Award from Monash, and a fellowship from the Australian Academy of Technical Sciences and Engineering. Members and guests, please join me in welcoming Peter Coleman.
Well, let's get this kicked off. Thanks very much for coming today and joining us for what I hope you will find an illuminating conversation, and it will be a conversation. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. I also acknowledge our distinguished guests today, including the patron of the Melbourne Mining Club, Saravi Parbo. It's an honour to speak at this club that has done so much to promote the value of Australia's resource endowment. It's also an honour to speak here in Victoria, where Woodside was formed almost 65 years ago. It's also the state, as you've just heard, where I grew up, a country kid from a working class background, the first in my family to get the opportunity to study at university. And it was here in Victoria that after studying engineering, I began working in an industry that continues to fascinate me, and that makes work pleasurable every day, as you know. Much has changed since Woodside was granted the first offshore exploration licence in Victoria in 1956. At that time, the tenacious junior explorer was setting new world records by drilling in water depth up to 60 metres deep. Now technology and our own expertise has advanced a lot, and we can safely and productively drill in water depths now more than 40 times that, yes, more than 2.5 kilometres just in the water. After a decade of exploration in Australia's southeast, Woodside headed to the northwest of the continent in search of gas, and thus was born an industry that would contribute billions of dollars to the Australian economy, delivering thousands of jobs and secure energy supply for Western Australia, while also creating strong export markets. The evolution of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, since then is just one chapter in the remarkable story of Australian resources development, a story that is still being written as new technologies facilitate new approaches. The advent of LNG allowed Australia to unlock value from a new parcel of its resource endowment, drawing on very significant investments from both developers and customers. Now, it's not lost on me that a similar story was playing out here in Victoria in the 1960s, as the state government worked with SO and BHP to provide the investment certainty and infrastructure required to replace gas produced from coal to enable the development of the Bass Strait fields. In Western Australia, Sir Charles Court laid the firm foundations for an industry that has become a massive contributor to the state, backing in the Dampier to Bunbury pipeline and the contracts that underpinned it. So where are these leaders today? Where are the communities that support them and the industries that support them? Today, society continues to benefit from the far-sighted and difficult decisions taken by leaders in decades past. But I lament that their foresight has brought complacency, leading us into an abyss of indecision, negative politics, and not in my backyard obstructionism. Would these attitudes have seen the development of Victoria's iconic tram system, or of Melbourne's wonderful sporting precinct with such world-class facilities as the MCG and Melbourne Park? Where is the vision from our leaders today? We must move away from the politics of no and work to establish a common purpose. Politicians, community leaders and industry have a responsibility to work together on tackling the big challenges we all face. As a nation, we're blessed with a rich and diverse resource endowment, which comes with a duty to develop it in a timely and responsible way. We have the resources, we have the capabilities. The demand is there, with Australia right on the doorstep of the world's fastest growing markets. And if we are to unlock the full value of our resources for the Australian people, we need policies that provide certainty for investment decisions as Australia competes for global capital. Now, Australia's financial system will likely never be big enough to support the capital required for massive resource projects. Australia will always have to attract funding from foreign sources. As we compete for capital globally, we need vision and leadership, but we also need enabling laws and regulation that applies to our taxes, our environmental regulation, our education, immigration, and industrial relations systems. It's time to reset the public discourse and focus on what future we can build for our children and our grandchildren, and what legacy we can be proud to leave behind. With that in mind, let's talk about the issue that presents the greatest challenge to our society: climate change. Australia has all the resources it needs to support a lower carbon society, both at home and abroad, and to do that in an internationally competitive way that ensures continued growth and jobs for Australia. Climate change and the policy decisions associated with it affect all members of the community. We face a choice: to act or not to act. In my view, it's imperative that we act. The scientists have warned of the consequences of inaction. Regardless of what you think of that science, if we wait to see if the scientists are right or not, then simply it's going to be too late. So prudence dictates that we think about what contribution we can make, individually and collectively, to mitigating the effects of climate change. In its most recent report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has issued a challenge to the world, outlining the radical change that will be needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. If the world's going down that path, it is clear we will need new ways of generating energy. And we're working on those, but the reality is the world is still struggling to find a consensus around a 2-degree pathway, and achieving even that will require innovative energy solutions and a growing role for natural gas in the decades ahead. Without a carbon price, we're stuck with a patchwork of national approaches loosely coordinated under the Paris Agreement. And so we need to deal with the problems inherent in this piecemeal approach. As nations pursue different levels of ambition, trade and competitiveness issues arise across borders. We must consider the impact on emissions-intensive, trade-exposed industries. Otherwise, national action will be constrained by the needs of the most vulnerable sector. If we want deep emissions cuts, then we need to reconcile them with economic competitiveness. A failure to do so is to set up emissions reductions as being in conflict with jobs, and we all know where that ends. So finding ways to cut emissions while protecting jobs is not a trade-off with emissions reduction, it is a prerequisite for it. International carbon offsets would be a big step forward in allowing emissions reductions to be achieved at the lowest global cost. We can progress that at the COP24 in Poland in December by agreeing the rules for their application. In the absence of an appropriate carbon price, we risk a perverse outcome where the lowest cost of reliable supply into the market remains the greatest emitter of carbon, offsetting the benefits renewables offer. Today's policies simply do not take high-intensity carbon out of the market. This means that as renewables achieve scale, we risk wasting money on building more power into the system, resulting in generation overload. We risk ending up in a situation like Germany, where the growth in renewables without a corresponding increase in gas-fired power has resulted in issues with intermittency and overcapacity and failure to reach emissions reductions targets. If we reduce debate on climate policy to a showdown between coal and renewables, we lose sight of the options for a more balanced approach. Here in Australia, the lack of a clear roadmap from successive governments has left business uncertain with what they can contribute. But the past decade has shown we can't wait for government to lead us on this. As business leaders, we're used to calculating risk and managing it, and clearly the risk of inaction is too great. If we're to have a chance of transitioning to a lower carbon economy, large and experienced companies like ours will play a crucial role. Companies that employ people, thousands of people. Companies that are capable of building large facilities and running complex organisations. Companies that invest in industrial-scale technologies to deliver efficiencies. Companies that have a track record for supplying energy to customers in Asian megacities. Companies that are prepared to take risks but need appropriate returns and therefore need certainty from government, the sort of certainty that only comes from a bipartisan approach. We are the companies that can support a balanced and socially cohesive approach that secures emissions reductions while maintaining economic competitiveness, improving urban air quality and increasing access to modern energy. We may well be at the dawn of a new era for energy, but it's an era that builds on Australia's decades of experience supplying energy around the world. It's an era that will be ushered in by commercial imperatives. Governments do play a role in incentivising the development of lower carbon energy sources and providing the certainty that industry needs to pursue them. But the demand will come from customers, and we're seeing commercial pressures already from Woodside's customers in Japan and Korea, who are encouraging us to develop hydrogen power as a carbon-neutral energy source that can ultimately be derived from renewable resources. Green hydrogen is a longer-term goal, using renewable power to source hydrogen from water. But to get there, we need low-cost hydrogen, for instance, from natural gas, to build scale and experience in hydrogen transport and distribution. This so-called blue hydrogen uses steam methane reforming to produce hydrogen from natural gas. And natural gas, of course, is largely made up of methane, containing 4 hydrogen atoms. This is proven technology today, but more research and development is needed, particularly into the shipping of hydrogen. Already, some of our destination markets are using LNG to produce hydrogen, which makes sense, given LNG is hydrogen-rich and easily transportable. The existing technology can provide the impetus for building a new supply chain that will be needed as we work towards bulk production of hydrogen powered by renewables, drawing on Australia's natural advantage of sunlight and vast spaces. This emerging power source has the potential to transform our industrial sector, offering carbon-free pathways for energy-intensive manufacturing and for heavy transport. We can take the first step already by using the abundant natural gas available off Western Australia as feedstock for hydrogen production, as we target a future world of green hydrogen from water using renewable power. And we're already seeing quite a revolution underway on shipping emissions. The world has taken real action to curb sulphur emissions from marine fuels, spurred on by community concerns about health consequences. The International Maritime Organisation's tighter cap on sulphur emissions from shipping fuels from 2020 will have a significant impact on the cost of seaborne trade. This is likely to be the first in a series of steps to reduce the environmental footprint of shipping. It behooves governments to move forward as quickly as possible with industries that are able to support changes in the shipping fleet to lower emissions fuels. Other governments are already acting to seize this opportunity, whether through incentives to build LNG-fuelled vessels or reduction in port fees. Other countries, including the United States, have implemented emission controls areas along their coastlines that impose even tighter restrictions than the IMO, thereby incentivising shipping companies to adopt cleaner fuels. We've worked together across the resources industries to prepare for the new IMO regime. Through the Green Corridor project, we have collaborated with resources and shipping partners, including Rio Tinto, BHP, Fortescue and Shell, to design LNG-fuelled vessels that could ship Australian resources exports to the world. There is the opportunity for Australia to be a world leader on this, but it's going to require a joint effort from across the resources and shipping industries and leadership from the government. The opportunity is broader than just shipping. There's a chance to achieve emissions reductions consistent with industrial development if governments incentivise the switch from diesel to LNG fuelling of mine trucks and locomotives. The Pilbara in northwestern Australia is the ideal place to drive this transition, and Woodside is developing the infrastructure to support it. But there may be a role for government to provide appropriate incentives for the conversion of industrial vehicles. Now, in WA, we have a long history of providing gas to local customers, and Woodside's commitment to develop LNG as a transport fuel is a new way for us to supply Western Australian resources to local industry. The domestic gas reservation policy has existed in some form in WA since the North West Shelf Agreement was signed in 1979, so it's not a new idea, guys. It's true that the industry has at times railed against the progressive tightening of the policy, but we've learned to accommodate it, and the upshot is that domestic gas and LNG for export are no longer perceived as being conflicting priorities. In WA, their relationship is symbiotic. Now, of course, the case is less clear in those states where the connection to international markets hike prices and squeeze domestic supply, adding to pressures on local manufacturing that were already under pressure. Politicians responded by threatening intervention in export markets with tools that have undermined security. This has in turn created a climate of uncertainty that is perilous for new investment and can jeopardise new supply. So how do we turn this vicious circle into a virtuous circle? Well, firstly, I applaud the Queensland Government's approach of setting aside future acreage for domestic gas use only. It's a start. This provides investors with the certainty they need as they make decisions on potential developments. We must move away from mechanisms that try to control prices after investments have been made. Repeated interventions risk teaching both suppliers and consumers that the right strategy is simply to wait for a political crisis to emerge to bring down prices, and that's simply an irresponsible way to manage the nation's resources. Complex policy dilemmas require consultation and rational decision-making rather than populist responses to rolling crises. Time and time again, decisions taken whilst in crises end up needing to be unpicked. And I'm talking here about short-term decisions that are ostensibly principles-based, but have ramifications that have not been thought through. Decisions like state governments imposing moratoria on gas exploration and development right at a time when new supply is needed. Decisions like the ACCC's move to declare LNG export parity prices as the default market price in the eastern states. This has encouraged domestic-only gas producers in New South Wales and Victoria to lift their prices, even though their exposure to export markets is nil to minimal. The East Coast gas crisis resulted from a range of factors. Producers failed to develop the anticipated resources. Some large industrial consumers neglected to manage price risk, failing to deploy the sophisticated buying strategies that are advisable for companies so reliant on gas. And governments lacked the right policy settings to appropriately regulate new developments. For the security of gas producers and the customers they supply, each state needs a process to reassure the community that the reasonable domestic gas needs of Australians will be met. This may be achieved through the reservation of acreage or of volumes of domestic gas. The reality is that there's no simple fix to the East Coast gas crisis. I don't have a wand today. But there are options for ameliorating it, and I'm definitely not talking about a west-to-east pipeline. It might seem like a simple solution, but in reality would serve neither the East Coast nor the West Coast gas consumers well. For one thing, a pipeline would create a price floor in the East, not a price cap. Its construction is conservatively estimated to cost $5 billion. I think that's very optimistic. And this cost would be baked into household energy bills forever. What is more, gas pipelines are built to be full. So long-term demand needs to be aggregated and underpinned through take-or-pay agreements. Now, Sir Charles Court was prepared to do this in WA decades ago, based on careful calculations of projected demand, but I don't see anybody prepared to take that risk today. A much more sensible approach is to establish a virtual pipeline, linking eastern gas markets to multiple sources of supply via one or more import terminals. This is better suited to the vast distances and small volumes of gas that are involved and can disrupt East Coast gas markets and mitigate against opportunistic price gouging. Now, I mentioned at the start that this is an industry that continues to fascinate me even after all of these years, and there's a range of reasons for that, including the vital role that our industry plays in unlocking value for society through the development of resources that are owned by the Australian people. That's economic value, social value, and value from the delivery of energy and other industrial inputs. Now, I know in this club I'm really preaching to the choir with that argument, and we've got a magnificent organ behind me. But it's also important that we must make these arguments to a broader audience and a younger audience, including to those who think that we're industries of the past and who challenge our ongoing relevance. The reality is that we are the companies and industries that can be a bridge to the future. This country has a long history of visionary leaders who have taken calculated risks to develop our wonderful resource endowment. Some of those leaders are here today, and I pay tribute in particular to Sir Avi. Today, as we face the competing challenges of global climate change and maintaining a prosperous future for our people through the creation of jobs, we need those visionaries again across government, the community and industry. I've outlined today a vision that includes an increased use of our current resources in transportation, but also a future where we value add by developing new energy sources. This includes drawing on Australia's abundant renewable resources like solar to produce a future where hydrogen is a significant energy source for the world. By 2030, we think hydrogen could already be providing industrial scale power to the world. What I would not like to see in 2030, when the Melbourne Mining Club will be approaching almost 200 speeches, is a country that has squandered its resource endowment and is stuck in a cycle of perpetual uncertainty and policy and political crisis. What I would like to see is an Australia that is harnessing value from its rich and diverse resources and is forging ahead with new energy sources while continuing to draw value from the resources that have underpinned our prosperity for decades. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's Q&A time. Richard Shoddy is over here on this side of the room and Sam Street is this side. We have one here. Richard, you've got one there? And I think your second one will be Joe Kukutsa. I can see Joe there. Your first question's here.
Hello, my name's Arthur. I'm a student at the University of Melbourne. And what I wanted to ask was whether you think that the cost of carbon should be paid at the point of consumption or the point of production. Personally, I would prefer these taxes to be collected here in Australia.
Thanks, Arthur, and it's a good question. It's probably one I'm not the expert on, but it certainly needs to be collected at some point in the consumption chain. Of course, if you're government, you like to capture that tax at the point in which the resource is developed. It's an easier point to capture it. Once you get beyond that, of course, the multiples of hands that it goes through becomes more and more difficult to actually track it over time. So of course the default position is always to go as far as upstream as you can, because you have less people or less entities involved in that. You know, I don't have a particular position on it. As you know, successive governments in Australia for the last dozen years or so have played around with different carbon regimes, and it's at a point now that it's a political hot potato and nobody will touch it. You know, I don't think Australia is going to lead in this space. I think internationally we've got to drive the change and get our international partners through COP24 or through the COP process to start putting their minds to how do we have international carbon pricing and how does it apply. But what I do know, unless we do, of course, lowest cost of supply will always be the thing that goes into the market. And if you ignore climate change and you say that climate change is not happening, then you don't believe in a carbon price. If you do believe climate change is happening, then you do believe that there is a price that needs to be paid for the emissions that we have in our industries. But today, I don't think anybody's come up with a universal solution. But equally today, I don't see anybody putting a lot of effort into it. And I think in the absence of that, you're seeing both national governments, particularly in Europe and elsewhere, and then state governments, and you've seen things here in Australia, taking their own actions, coming out with their own renewables targets, coming out with their own carbon policies, coming out with their own carbon taxes like you see in the provinces in Canada. And I think we just need to move away from this piecemeal approach. It says in isolated areas people are willing to make those decisions and to make those changes. We operate in some of them. And what I'm appealing for is a universal approach to this, and a universal approach that people understand.
Peter, across here. Next question.
Hi, Peter. Thank you very much for a great presentation. Adrian Prendergast from Morgans Financial. So you mentioned that what the world really needs is to set a global price for carbon, but as you just mentioned in your other answer as well, there's also a patchwork of different approaches from different nations and regulators, some of them pulling in very different directions. For your own internal planning purposes, do you come up with a notional price for carbon, and does that play a role in your investment approach for projects?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, we do. So we test all of our projects against what we expect likely carbon outcomes will be, and of course we go through all of the different scenarios and then try and price that in. Now we don't always publish that price because we actually think in the absence of policy sometimes that's like bears to a honeypot for politicians. You start publishing a price that you think is a market bearable price for your project, and of course that's a matter from heaven for the tax department. They'll come straight after that one and say, okay, you can pay that. So I think you have to be a bit pragmatic about it with respect to that. I mean, there are requirements in certain jurisdictions where you have to publish your resilience to certain scenarios around carbon. We're not in those jurisdictions, but we certainly run the same scenarios. We're confident of our business. It's a very resilient business, and that's my point. If the world's really going to make the changes and get the balance, I think there's a lot of debate at the moment around how much renewables do we need or don't we need, and it's because at the moment there's no mechanism in place that's a choke on the system or a dampener on the system. So okay, now we're coming up to a pricing point. I don't think the world knows, and certainly in Australia, we don't know what the pricing point is at this time as to when you move between one form of energy and another. And of course it's being disrupted by government policies, state government policies, well-intended policies, but they're very disruptive policies. And of course each time we come up to an election, it looks like we need to increase that renewables target by at least 10% or 20% to beat the other guy in their campaign. And I'm sorry, but the one-upmanship at the moment is just not affordable, and it's going to start putting people out of jobs really soon.
Peter, just here, Joe's got a question.
Joe Kukutsa, Managing Director of Mara International. Peter, an elegant discussion on the need for leadership. My question actually follows a little bit the last one. Some realists believe that politicians aren't going to do anything until the Pacific Ocean starts lapping, the Atlantic Ocean starts lapping the White House. Given the problems of getting governments around the world to actually act in concert regarding a global carbon price, Where does industry fit in trying to actually make this happen?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, because one of the perverse outcomes of the US's growth in oil, in the development of oil through the shale revolution, is in fact it's getting a lot of gas for free. About a third of the gas in the US market today comes from as a byproduct of the production of oil, and it's mainly due to the development of shale oil. Now what that does, it means now that the pricing point is such as the US now in power generation is mostly using gas for power generation, and it's using it for other fuels. If you actually have a look at the US's carbon intensity today, it's actually lower than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And so even without policy, market has actually driven the US into the place where it wanted to be, which I think is probably why some lawmakers in the US feel that they don't need to be shackled by some of these international agreements with respect to carbon policy, because they're actually already achieving some of it at home, but it's being market driven through substitution of gas for other fuels. And so I think it's going to be really difficult, because at the end of the day, it's going to be, you know, what's in it for me? And for countries, and particularly big countries like the US, who are already in that space, it's very difficult for them to reconcile. And you've seen similar issues in the UK. I mean, the UK now with Brexit, but the UK today, through their own carbon policies, I've seen numbers that say that their carbon intensity is actually the lowest it's been for a century. And that's simply because they've started switching fuels and fuel use. Now, they do have a carbon tax, and they're reviewing that tax at present, because what they've seen is the emissions trading numbers have gone up quite significantly. So they're actually looking at their own tax because they set a base tax. So at the moment, I can't give you, a lightning rod to say it should be led by the US or it should be led by Europe. Europe's always difficult to get to lead anything. And you've seen that because of policy, and I talked about Germany's challenge and how the politics in Germany actually drove them down a different path. And of course now Nord Stream 2 is getting caught up in other politics, and Nord Stream 2 coming into Germany would certainly help in changing their energy mix. So I don't see a mechanism outside of the COP mechanisms for governments internationally to be able to get in there and talk about it. And then they have mechanisms themselves under trade agreements and so forth, that could be the enabling mechanisms to actually be enforcement in these areas. But you have to first decide what it is that you want to do, and somebody needs to take leadership on it, and the international community at the moment is floundering, I must say, in this regard. In fact, it's not even on the agenda for COP24. The biggest thing we could hope for in COP24 is emissions credits that we generate here in Australia, that we're actually able to trade them globally. And at the moment, under the Paris Agreement, of course, credits that a company like mine might actually generate somewhere else in the world are not able to be offset against emissions here in Australia. And of course, that's again stifling where the market should be, and those trade-offs should be in the best places in the world. They shouldn't be bound by national boundaries.
It's Neil Parker. I'm a retired gentleman. Some might not say that. I would like to congratulate you on your speech. I thought it was fantastic. And the main thing that I'm standing here for is to ask Hugh Morgan that maybe he could speak to you to join those in Canberra and make a contribution to our national psychic in mining. And I thought it was excellent, and thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Neil, and I can assure you, many of the people in this room are working hard every day, both with state and federal governments, on trying to influence policy outcomes and to, get some of the sensible decisions made that we're talking about. I think the key is going to be, though, that as a nation, we need to start demanding these things and expecting these things. So, we're in this situation because this is a situation that we made for ourselves. It's time now to step back from that and say, is really this the future that we want for our children and our grandchildren. I would say, if you went and polled the room, you'd say, we really kind of had enough of this, to be quite honest, and it's time now to start moving beyond it. We do have the capabilities, we have the leadership talent in this country, we have the leadership talent in Canberra, quite frankly, and in the States, and we need to let them loose and to be able to start creating people who can take real visions and turn it into reality. Now, those new real visions doesn't mean you have to go build things. And you've got to remember that Charlie Court came under a lot of criticism for the deal he did on the Dampier-Bunbury pipeline, and subsequent governments tried to unpick the contracts. Now, they're a bit embarrassed about that today, and they don't actually talk about the fact that they tried to unpick those contracts because, of course, it's been a tremendous boon to Western Australia, and it's been a tremendous contributor to jobs in that state, and it continues to be so, and it will be for the next 40 years.
Okay, Peter, I think we have time for one more question over here. Thank you. Last one.
Hi, Peter. Deborah Sterling, representing Monash University. And I would like to thank Woodside for the enormous investment that you've made, not only at Monash but other universities, in research, your forward-thinking approach there, and also the 100 or so graduates that you employ each year. A great effort, thank you. But I'd like to talk to you about the attractiveness of our resource industry for young people, because there wouldn't be a company here represented in this room that is not going to struggle either now or in the future to attract young people. We know that the data shows that of mining engineers alone, it's going to take 147 years based on next year's enrolments to replace every employed mining engineer in Australia, and it's obviously impossible. So do you have any comments on how we can rebut the chorus of voices that are opposed to our industry? Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. And of course, Woodside's very proud of its Future Lab program and the relationship we have with Monash. And I can just give a secret to the room that that relationship's going to get stronger here over the next few months, and particularly in this endeavour in looking at how we can move to a cleaner energy society. Look, how do you get young people to want to join our industries? Well, we've got to go back and say what attracted us to our industries, and I think the key there is you have to be contemporary, you have to be relevant, you have to stand for something that appeals to the principles of these people. And I think we as industries have a challenge in that what we've done so far has brought us here. So what we've done so far has got us to a point, but we do run the risk of being almost like the whalers back in the 1800s who never thought that this new thing that Colonel Drake found at Spindletop was ever going to replace them. We need to start thinking differently, or else we'll become old industries, and old industries get taken over like the Baby Bells did in the US. So to do that, you've got to contemporise your industry. You've got to start to stand for something that is meaningful to these people, because they're your greatest ambassadors. They want to go home and be able to tell their friends and family why they made the choices they made and why they're doing the work that they are. They may thoroughly enjoy the work they're doing, but if they're not proud of the work they're doing, meaning they're not willing to go out and be your ambassador for our industries and for our companies, then we're not contemporising our business in a way that appeals to them. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean you give them a fancy new office or tell them that hot desking is a wonderful new thing, or now you get a new notebook computer and you can text everybody and I'm going to give you a lot more time off and so forth and so on. They don't actually want that. They want the same things that we want. They want the same dreams that we had. They want the same sense of belonging that we had. They want certainty. They want long careers. They don't want to be hip-hopping around all over the place. That's a total fallacy. It's a total fallacy. They want long careers. They want to feel like they're part of a family, but they want to feel like they're part of something that's important, something that's contributing to society each and every day. And I think we have a duty to spend the time to talk to them, to help them understand how we contribute. We're not just simply a cash register, but we're doing something that's meaningful, something that's great, something that's enduring, something that we'll all be proud of. And I think each and every business is going to have to think about what that means for them. For Woodside, it means particular things, and it means contemporising our business to become more a technology company. It means embracing data analytics. It means embracing artificial intelligence, robotics, additive manufacturing. It means looking at new energies and new fuels and new ways of doing things in a sensible way, still driven by economics, but in a sensible way. It looks at being part of the carbon debate. It looks at being part of debates such as same-sex marriage and so forth, things that are core and important to our people. No matter where you fit in that divide, no matter what your feelings are, we need to have a collective view of it. So to us, I think the challenge is, guys, we get too caught up in building big things. The kids of today really aren't that interested. The big things are big things. If you think about their world and the industries that attract them, they don't build big things. They build things that fit in your pocket. They build things that are virtual. We need to start to describe a world to our young people that is their world, the virtual world, the smaller world, but the world that's making a significant contribution to our society. Not a world that's been demonised, not things that are archaic relics of the past, but a new world. So I thank you for your question. Remember, our young people are our future. We were once young as well, and we owe it to them to provide them an opportunity that we had. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, there's some challenges there. Members and guests, would you please welcome Lorraine Meldrum of Swan Global to propose a vote of thanks. Lorraine.
It is especially good for us to be able to hear such an illuminating talk from Peter Coleman, albeit a summary talk on a huge subject and the vast areas that he represents. It has been said that gas will be squeezed out of the energy mix by the rise of batteries and renewables. But as Peter has said elsewhere, batteries pose no threat to gas. They won't generate energy, they just store it. He has also said that gas is an essential part of that cleaner future as a power source in its own right and in partnership with renewables. Peter also talks of Woodside's input re jobs of the future, using innovation that goes well beyond hard pipe technologies. So we can expect to hear a lot more good news from Peter Coleman, a lot more than we have heard today. Now, one other good thing, as a gift of appreciation, we have a bottle of wine for Peter, but not just any bottle of wine. A bottle of 15-year-old Cab Sav from a winery just 25 kilometres from the town beach of Woodside that gave Woodside Petroleum its name. The wine is from Tom's Cap Vineyard just up the road from Woodside in South Gippsland. The MMC's resident wine expert, Simon Jemison, claims it has a hint of blackberry and no hint of hydrocarbons. For Peter's wide-ranging talk today and what will be heard from Peter in the near future, please join me in thanking Peter Coleman.
Thanks, Lorraine.